Adventurous hiker eaten alive by savage mountain lion. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. Nathan Carter tightened the straps of his backpack and adjusted the weight on his shoulders. The late afternoon sun burned deep orange across the horizon, casting long shadows through the towering pine trees. The mountain air was crisp, the kind that filled your lungs with an icy sharpness and made you feel alive. This was why he hiked. To escape. To disconnect. To feel small in the vastness of nature. The trail had been long, 6 miles of rocky paths, winding through the forest, climbing in altitude. The further he went, the quieter it became. The sounds of civilization, cars, voices, the hum of the city, had disappeared hours ago. Now, all he could hear was the wind filtering through the trees, the occasional bird call, and the crunch of his boots against the dirt. Nathan took a swig from his water bottle, wiping sweat from his brow. He had about 1 more mile before he reached his intended campsite, a secluded clearing near the base of a rock formation. Perfect spot. He loved solo hiking. No distractions, no obligations, just him and the wild. But as he continued walking, a strange feeling began to creep up his spine. At first, he ignored it, chalked it up to exhaustion from the long trek. But the further he went, the stronger it became. A sense of being watched. Nathan stopped. He turned slowly, scanning the dense forest behind him. Nothing, just trees stretching high into the sky, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. He exhaled, shaking his head. Get a grip, Carter. Still, the sensation lingered. Something fell off. Nathan adjusted his pack and kept moving, picking up the pace. The sooner he reached camp, the better. 15 minutes later, Nathan found a clearing, a wide-open space surrounded by rock formations on 3 sides. A perfect shelter against the wind. He dropped his pack and stretched, rolling his sore shoulders. Alone, just how he liked it. The sky had begun to shift, the deep blues of twilight creeping in as the last remnants of sunlight bled into the distant horizon. He wasted no time, setting up his tent and unrolling his sleeping bag. Once camp was settled, he built a small fire. The flickering orange glow cast shadows along the rocky walls, offering a false sense of security. Nathan leaned back, taking a deep breath. This was peace. No phone, no emails, no obligations, just nature. Just him. But then, a snap in the distance. Nathan froze. His heart thumped once hard against his ribs. The sound had come from the trees, not the wind, not a falling branch. Something moving. Nathan slowly turned his head, eyes narrowing at the darkness beyond the firelight. Probably a deer, he murmured under his breath. Maybe a raccoon. The logical part of his brain knew this. Animals lived in the woods. But another part of him, the instinctual primal part, was screaming at him to listen, to be aware. Because something was out there, watching, waiting. And Nathan was alone. Nathan remained still, his breath shallow. His eyes scanned the tree lean, but the darkness beyond the fire revealed nothing. The night had fully settled and now, thick and absolute. The stars above were sharp and clear, but they offered no comfort, not when something was moving out there. He listened. The silence was almost worse than the noise, because he knew he had heard something. Twigs snapping, a rustle of leaves, something heavy shifting in the underbrush. And now it was completely still. Nathan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to relax. You're being paranoid. This was the wild, after all. Of course, there were animals. A fox, maybe. A coyote. They didn't want anything to do with him. Still, his body was on edge, his nerves buzzing with a nameless unease. He grabbed his flashlight, clicked it on, and swept the beam across the trees. Nothing. Just empty woods, shadows stretching long and twisted between the trunks. Nathan sighed. Okay, Carter. Stop freaking yourself out. He turned back toward the fire, tossing another log onto the crackling flames. The warmth felt good, chasing away the night's creeping chill. Everything was fine. Everything was. A deep, low growl shattered the silence. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. His body locked up, every instinct screaming at him to move, to run, to fight, to do something. Because that sound, that wasn't a raccoon. That wasn't a deer. That was a predator. Big one. And it was close. Nathan slowly turned his head toward the darkness. His heart pounded. The fire only illuminated so much. Beyond that, the shadows swallowed everything. But the growl had been real. It had been deep, guttural. Nathan clicked his flashlight back on, his hand shaking slightly. He swept the beam across the trees again, this time more frantic. And then, two glowing eyes stared back at him. Nathan stumbled backward, his pulse skyrocketing. For a moment, all he could do was stare. The eyes were unblinking, reflecting the light with a ghostly, eerie glow. They were set low to the ground, too low to be a bear, too large to be anything but one thing. A mountain lion. Nathan's breath came in short bursts, his mind racing. Mountain lions were apex predators. Unlike bears, they didn't bluff charge. They didn't warn you before they struck. They stalked. They waited. And then they killed. Nathan tightened his grip on the flashlight. He knew the rules. Make yourself big, loud, don't turn your back, don't run. Running triggered their instincts. Running made you prey. The fire crackled beside him, casting flickering shadows across his face. He squared his shoulders, forcing his voice to stay steady. Hey, get out of here. The mountain lion didn't move. Nathan's stomach twisted. It wasn't scared of him. He grabbed a burning stick from the fire and held it high, waving it. The flames danced, sending sparks into the air. Go, he shouted. Get the hell out of here. A long moment stretched between them. The lion's ears flattened slightly, its muscles twitching. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Nathan barely saw it move. 1 second, it was staring at him, and the next, it melted into the darkness, vanishing into the underbrush. But he knew better than to feel relief. It wasn't gone. It was circling, watching, waiting. Nathan backed toward his tent slowly, his pulse hammering. He kept his flashlight trained on the tree lean, his ears straining for the slightest sound. His breathing was too loud. Everything was too loud. Stay calm. Don't panic. He grabbed his knife from his pack, gripping the handle so tightly his knuckles ached. And then the growl came again. But this time, it was even closer. Nathan's pulse pounded in his ears. The growl had shifted. Closer. Somewhere behind him. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head. The fire crackled, casting flickering light against the rocky outcrop beside his tent. The shadows stretched, twisting into eerie shapes. But beyond that, darkness. His flashlight beam cut through the night, shaking slightly as he moved it across the tree lean. The underbrush remained still, silent, and that terrified him more than anything. Mountain lions weren't like other predators. They didn't charge blindly. They didn't waste energy. They hunted with patience. They waited for the perfect moment to strike. Nathan's grip on the knife tightened. His breath came shallow and fast. Think. He couldn't outrun it. Running would make him prey. But he couldn't stay still either, because he was already being hunted. He forced himself to move, backing slowly toward his tent. Keep your eyes on the trees. The fire gave him a small advantage. Animals feared fire, right? But deep down, he knew that wouldn't stop a starving predator. His boot hit something solid. The edge of his pack. His shotgun was inside. He had brought it just in case of bears. Not for this. His hands fumbled with the zipper. He couldn't afford to make noise, but his heart was hammering so hard it drowned out all logic. Hurry. The moment the zipper opened, a rush of relief surged through him, his fingers wrapped around the cold steel of the shotgun. Loaded. Safety off. He swallowed hard. His flashlight beam swept across the clearing again. Nothing. The silence felt wrong. Nathan's breathing came fast. His body screamed at him to run, to do something. Then, a flicker of movement. Low to the ground. Nathan barely had time to react before a shape exploded from the darkness. The mountain lion struck. The force of the impact ripped the air from his lungs. 1 second, he was standing, gripping his shotgun. The next, he was on the ground, his body slamming hard against the dirt. The weight of the animal crushed him. Razor-sharp claws tore into his shoulder, searing pain exploding down his arm. Nathan screamed, his flashlight spinning away, landing somewhere in the dirt, its beam casting wild, chaotic angles of light. He barely had time to process before the teeth came down. Jaws clamped onto his arm. Nathan thrashed, pure survival instincts kicking in. Fight, fight, fight. The shotgun was gone. He lost it in the struggle. The lion's growl was guttural, raw, vibrating through Nathan's entire body as it tightened its grip, shaking its head violently. Pain erupted. Nathan howled, his free hand grabbing for the knife still strapped to his belt. Move? No. Or you die. He found the handle. With every ounce of strength left in his body, he plunged the blade into the lion's side. The animal snarled in pain, its body twitching. Nathan didn't stop. He stabbed again and again. Blood, hot and thick, poured over his hands. The lion let out a deafening screech, releasing its grip on his arm just long enough for Nathan to throw his weight sideways. He rolled, gasping for air. His body screamed in pain. The mountain lion stumbled back, wounded, but not done. Nathan scrambled toward the fallen shotgun, his fingers slipping on blood. The lion lunged again. Nathan grabbed the barrel, turned, fired. The gunshot cracked through the night. A deafening silence followed. Nathan's chest heaved, his vision blurred, and as his body slumped against the dirt, he wasn't sure if he had one, or if he was dying. The world was a blur of pain and blood. Nathan's vision swam as he lay sprawled on the dirt, his chest heaving, his ears ringing from the gunshot. His fingers trembled as they clutched the shotgun, his body still tensed for another attack. But for a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. The mountain lion lay just feet away, its body twitching. Its snarling breaths were ragged, uneven, the gaping wound in its side leaking dark blood into the soil. The beast's golden eyes were still locked onto Nathan, but the fire within them was dimming, flickering like a dying flame. Nathan coughed, each breath sending a fresh wave of pain through his shredded arm. He struggled to sit up, his muscles screaming in protest. The taste of blood filled his mouth, his or the lion's, he couldn't tell. His fingers were slick with a mixture of sweat, dirt, and something far thicker. The lion let out a final, broken growl, its powerful body shuddering before slumping lifeless against the earth. Nathan stared, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his entire body trembling. It was dead. It had to be. A wave of exhaustion crashed over him, but he couldn't rest. Not yet. His vision blurred again, black spots creeping at the edges. He forced himself to move, dragging his body toward his backpack. His injured arm hung useless at his side, hot blood dripping steadily into the dirt. He was losing too much. He needed to stop the bleeding. With his good hand, he tore through his pack, shoving aside extra clothes and food until his fingers found the small first aid kit buried at the bottom. He ripped it open with his teeth, yanking out the gauze and pressing it hard against the deep gashes in his shoulder. He hissed through clenched teeth, his head swimming with dizziness. His arm was in bad shape, deep claw wounds, punctures from the lion's teeth. His body screamed in pain, but he had to keep moving. His fingers fumbled for the roll of bandages, wrapping them tightly around his arm. It wasn't enough. He needed a tourniquet. Looking around, he spotted one of the straps from his backpack. It would have to do. He looped it around his upper arm, pulling it tight until he felt the blood flow slow. The pressure made him want to scream, but he clenched his jaw and forced himself to endure it. The fire was still crackling beside him, casting long, flickering shadows across the rocky ground. His breath hitched as his mind caught up to everything that had happened. He had survived. He had killed a mountain lion with nothing but a knife, a gun, and sheer desperation. But he wasn't safe yet. His wounds were bad. He had lost a lot of blood. His body was battered, exhausted, barely holding on, and he was still miles from civilization, deep in the wilderness, with no way to call for help. The radio. His heart pounded as he remembered the emergency radio in his pack. He fumbled for it, his good hand shaking as he turned the dial. Static crackled to life. Mayday. This is Nathan Carter. I've been attacked. His voice was weak, barely more than a rasp. He swallowed, trying to steady his breath. Mountain lion. Badly injured. Need assistance. Coordinates. Silence. The radio buzzed with empty static. No response. His chest tightened. The signal wasn't reaching anyone. The valley, the dense forest. It was blocking everything. He cursed under his breath, his heartbeat hammering painfully against his ribs. He had two choices: stay here and risk bleeding out, or move and try to find higher ground for a signal. Neither option was good, but staying still meant death. Gritting his teeth, he grabbed his knife, his shotgun, and whatever supplies he could carry. His entire body ached as he staggered to his feet. The ground swayed beneath him, and for a second he thought he might collapse. But he forced himself to move. One step, then another. Each footfall sent a fresh wave of pain through his limbs, but he pressed forward, toward survival, toward hope, toward a chance to make it out of this nightmare alive. Nathan forced himself forward, each step an agonizing battle against the pain searing through his body. His injured arm throbbed violently with every movement, the hastily wrapped bandages already soaking through with blood. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body running on nothing but sheer willpower and adrenaline. The darkness pressed around him, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of his boots against the dirt, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the faint whistle of the wind threading through the trees. The fire he had left behind flickered weakly in the distance, shrinking with each painful step. He had to find higher ground. His radio was useless down here in the valley. If he could just reach an elevation point, maybe, just maybe, he could get a signal strong enough to call for help. Nathan's body screamed at him to stop, to rest, but he knew what would happen if he did. He would bleed out. He would pass out. And if another predator came sniffing around, whether it was scavengers or another mountain lion, he wouldn't be able to fight back. He tightened his grip on the shotgun, his fingers trembling. His free hand pressed against his wounded arm, trying to slow the bleeding. The climb ahead was brutal. The incline was steep, the rocky terrain uneven beneath his boots. His legs felt weak, each step shaky and unsteady. The stars above blurred in his vision, black spots creeping at the edges. Don't stop. Don't stop. Don't stop. His breath came in ragged bursts, the air thin, cold, biting against his skin. Sweat slicked his forehead despite the chill, his body burning up from exertion and blood loss. Halfway up the slope, his foot caught on a loose rock. His balance wavered, and then he fell. The ground rushed up to meet him, and before he could react, his body slammed hard against the jagged rocks. Pain exploded across his side, sharp and unforgiving. His vision flashed white, a strangled cry tearing from his throat as he rolled down several feet before coming to a jarring stop. For a moment, everything was still. Nathan lay on his back, gasping, the taste of copper thick on his tongue. His entire body pulsed with pain, a deep, dull ache that spread from his ribs down to his legs. His injured arm was screaming in protest, the bandages slipping, fresh blood trickling down his sleeve. He blinked up at the sky, dazed, his mind swimming. Had he broken something? His fingers curled weakly against the dirt. He clenched his jaw and forced himself to move, pushing through the unbearable pain. His ribs hurt badly, but nothing felt shattered. Bruised, maybe. But he wasn't dead yet. Nathan groaned, dragging himself upright. His head spun violently, his stomach twisting with nausea. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe through the dizziness. Higher ground. He had to keep going. He dug his boots into the dirt, using his good arm to help brace himself against the incline. His muscles burned, exhaustion weighing him down, but he refused to stop. 10 more feet. 5. And then finally he reached the peak. Nathan nearly collapsed, his legs trembling, his lungs burning. He dropped to his knees, struggling to steady himself. His hands fumbled for the radio, his fingers barely able to grasp it through the numbness creeping into his limbs. With a shaky breath, he turned a dial. Mayday, his voice was hoarse, weak. This is Nathan Carter, attacked, injured, need immediate assistance. The radio crackled, static hissing through the speaker. For a terrifying second, there was nothing. Then, a voice. Copy that, Nathan. We hear you. Stay where you are. Help is coming. Nathan let out a shuddering breath. He had done it. He was going to make it. His vision blurred, his body sagging in relief. His fingers loosened their grip on the radio as exhaustion finally took over. And then, everything went black. Darkness consumed him. A deep, suffocating void where time didn't exist. Then voices. Distant, muffled, A pressure on his chest, a sharp sting in his arm. The sensation of being lifted moved. Nathan's mind swam through the haze, trying to surface. He fought against the weight pulling him under, clinging to the slivers of awareness slipping through the fog. His body felt heavy, his limbs unresponsive. Then, sunlight. Blinding, fluorescent, too white, too artificial. The scent of antiseptic filled his nose. A beeping sound echoed in his ears, steady and rhythmic. His fingers twitched against fabric. Not dirt, not rock, but something soft. Sheets. Bed. Nathan blinked sluggishly, his vision swimming before sharpening. He was in a hospital. For a long moment, he just breathed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to process the fact that he was alive. Nathan. The voice was familiar, gruff, filled with restrained concern. He turned his head, his muscles protesting, and found a man standing by the door. Sheriff Tom Everett. Nathan swallowed, his throat aching like sandpaper. "You got my call," he rasped. Everett smirked, arms crossed over his chest. "Barely. You were damn near gone when we found you." Nathan exhaled, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He remembered the mountain lion. The fight, the climb, the fall, the desperate radio call. "How bad is it?" he asked, glancing down at himself. His arm was wrapped in thick bandages, his ribs tightly secured beneath hospital gowns. His body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder. Everett's smirk faded. "You lost a lot of blood. Infection almost got you before we did. Another few hours out there, and you wouldn't have made it." Nathan nodded slowly. "Mountain lion?" Everett let out a long breath. "We found the body. Hell of a fight you put up." He shook his head. Damn thing must have been desperate, attacking like that. Nathan closed his eyes. Desperate. It hadn't been just hunger. It had been survival. Just like him. Everett studied him for a moment before speaking again, his voice quieter. "You're lucky, Carter." Nathan chuckled dryly. "Doesn't feel like it. Could have gone a lot worse." Everett's expression darkened slightly. "And if it had, you wouldn't be here to talk about it." Nathan didn't respond. Because he knew. He had walked the line between life and death, teetered on the edge of the abyss. And somehow, against all odds, he had made it back. But something inside him had changed. He wasn't sure he would ever set foot in the wilderness alone again. Not after this. Nathan exhaled, staring at the ceiling, letting reality settle in. He was alive. Scarred, broken, but alive. And that was enough. For now. The hospital walls were too white, too sterile. Nathan stared at the ceiling, trying to ground himself, but the beeping machines and distant murmurs of nurses only made him feel trapped. He had spent days, maybe longer, lying in this bed, recovering. His body was healing, but his mind? That was another story. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the woods. Back in the dirt, under the weight of the lion, its claws sinking into his flesh. Back on the slope, bleeding, stumbling, fighting for his life. He flinched when a nurse walked in, her soft footsteps too quiet, too much like something stalking. "Mr. Carter," she asked gently. Nathan swallowed, forcing himself to focus. "Yeah, you're healing well. The doctors say you should be able to leave in a few more days." Leave? The word felt heavy. Where would he go? Back to an empty apartment? Back to his old life, as if nothing had happened? He wasn't sure if that life even existed anymore. He nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Thanks." The nurse smiled kindly and adjusted his fore. "You're lucky," she said, almost absent-mindedly. "Most people don't survive mountain lion attacks." Nathan's jaw clenched. Lucky. Everyone kept saying that. But the thing was, he didn't feel lucky. He felt like he had left a part of himself out there in those woods. Something primal. Something that would never fully return. That night, sleep was impossible. Nathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the dim glow of the hallway lights slipping through the crack under his door. His body ached, his arm throbbed, but it was nothing compared to the restlessness gnawing at him. The hospital was safe, secure. He was out of danger. But his mind refused to accept that. Every sound, every whisper of footsteps, every distant beep of a machine felt wrong, felt like something watching, like something waiting. He closed his eyes, trying to will himself to sleep. But the moment his eyelids shut, the memories surged forward. The glowing eyes staring at him from the tree lean, the snarling breath against his skin, the feeling of teeth sinking into his arm. Nathan's body jerked awake, heart hammering. His hands gripped the sheets, damp with sweat. His breathing was ragged, sharp, too loud in the quiet room. He ran a shaking hand down his face. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Nathan checked out of the hospital 2 days later. The doctors gave him strict instructions: rest, physical therapy, avoid strenuous activity. The sheriff gave him a firm pat on the back and told him he'd done something most men wouldn't live to talk about. Everyone seemed to think this was the end of the story, that he could just walk away from it. But as Nathan stepped out into the fresh air for the first time in weeks, he felt no relief. The sky was bright, the sun warm against his skin. But it was wrong. Too exposed. Too open. The noises of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the wail of an ambulance somewhere down the street felt foreign, as if he didn't belong here, as if a part of him was still in the mountains. His ride pulled up to the curb. It was a friend of his, Mike, a fellow hiker, someone who had always shared his love for the wild. Mike stepped out, grinning. "Damn, Carter, you look like hell." Nathan forced a smirk. "Feel like it too." Mike clapped him on the back. Too hard. Nathan stiffened. Too sudden. Too much like the impact of the lion slamming into him. Mike didn't notice. "Come on, man. Let's get you home." Home? Nathan wasn't sure that word meant anything anymore. The apartment was exactly as he left it. The hiking gear still sat by the door, his boots lined up neatly against the wall. The backpack he had used on the trip had been recovered, now resting on the kitchen counter, washed clean, like nothing had happened. Like it wasn't covered in his own blood just weeks ago. Nathan ran a hand over his face. The air inside felt stale, suffocating. He walked into the kitchen, grabbing a beer from the fridge, but when he twisted the cap off, his hand shook. He ignored it. Took a sip. It didn't help. His eyes drifted toward the window. The city sprawled out below him, cars moving, people living their normal lives. For weeks, he had fought to stay alive. He had killed to survive. And now, none of it mattered here. No one understood. No one could. Nathan gritted his teeth and turned away. He needed air. That night, he couldn't sleep. The apartment was too quiet in all the wrong ways. He had spent so long listening for movement, for sound of something stalking him. Now, there was nothing. And that was worse. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the lion's eyes. Saw its muscles coiling before it lunged. Felt its weight crushing him to the dirt. His body jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his heartbeat like a drum in his chest. He rubbed his hands over his face, breathing heavily. This wasn't working. The walls were closing in. The city felt wrong. He needed to go back, just for a few hours, just to prove to himself that he wasn't afraid, that he still owned himself. Nathan grabbed his keys. It was time to go back to the mountains. The drive to the mountains was long, but Nathan barely noticed. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind a battlefield of thoughts he couldn't silence. The hum of the road was dull, distant. He was barely present. All he could think about was that night. The weight of the lion. The blood. The sheer desperation of clawing his way out of the wilderness. Now, sitting in the driver's seat with a mountain range looming ahead, he didn't know if he was running toward closure or straight back into his nightmare. The asphalt turned to gravel as he neared the trailhead. He parked and cut the engine, his breath steady, controlled. This was it. Just a quick hike. Just to prove to himself that he wasn't broken. The second he stepped out of the car, the smell hit him. Pine, earth, cold mountain air. It should have felt familiar, comforting. Instead, it sent a chill through his entire body. Nathan swallowed hard and adjusted his pack. He wasn't going deep, just enough to remind himself that he was still the same man. He took his first step, then another, and then he was back on the trail. The deeper he went, the heavier his chest felt. Every sound, every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig made his muscles tighten, his breath hitch. He had walked these trails 100 times before. But now they felt different. as if the woods themselves were watching him. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying distant, hollow echoes of the past. He stopped at a familiar ridge, looking out over the valley. The same valley he had almost died in. Nathan exhaled, gripping the straps of his pack. This was it. He had made it back, but something in him still felt unfinished. His gaze drifted toward the tree line, toward the shadows stretching beneath the towering pines. He felt it. Something watching. His chest tightened. He turned, scanning the underbrush. Nothing. And yet, the sensation wouldn't leave. Nathan's fingers brushed against the knife at his hip. He had promised himself he wouldn't do this, that he wouldn't let the fear win. But then, a low rustle. Nathan's breath hitched. His heart pounded against his ribs. His eyes locked onto a dark figure in the brush. A shape, low to the ground. Still, he froze, and then golden eyes blinked back at him. Nathan's entire body locked up. For a single, unbearable second, everything stopped. Then the shape moved, but not forward. Not toward him. Away. It slunk back into the shadows, vanishing like smoke between the trees. Nathan stood there, his pulse roaring in his ears. His breath came in short, uneven gasps. His fingers trembled over the knife's handle. The lion hadn't attacked, hadn't even lingered. It had just watched, and then left. Nathan exhaled slowly, his entire body releasing a tension he hadn't even realized he was holding. It was over. It had been over for a long time. He had just been the last one to accept it. Nathan turned toward the trailhead, his steps slow but steady. This time, when he left the mountains, he didn't feel like he was running. He felt like he was leaving something behind. And for the first time since that night, he was okay with that. Nathan walked slowly back to his car, his heartbeat finally settling into something steady, something normal. He had come here expecting fear, expecting to relive that night, expecting to feel that same crippling terror the moment he stepped into the woods. But now, as he reached the edge of the trail, something unexpected settled over him. Relief. Not because he had faced his fear, not because he had seen another lion and survived the encounter, but because he had let go. For weeks, he had carried the weight of that night like a boulder strapped to his back. The fear, the pain, the helplessness. It had followed him like a second shadow, growing heavier with every sleepless night, every flashback, every time someone called him lucky. But here, in the very place that had almost killed him, he realized something. He was still here, still breathing, still standing. And the lion? It had never been hunting him. Not really. It had only been fighting to survive, just like he had. Nathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair as he unlocked his car. His hands weren't shaking anymore. He wasn't drowning in the past, wasn't suffocating beneath memories that refused to let him move forward. For the first time in weeks, he felt in control. The drive back home was different this time. The city no longer felt alien. The skyline no longer loomed like a cage, trapping him between concrete and glass. He rolled the window down, letting the cool mountain air flood through the car. It smelled different now. Not like a battlefield. Not like a place he had barely escaped, but like a place that had tested him and let him go. And that made all the difference. That night, Nathan slept without waking. No nightmares. No racing heartbeat. No phantom growls in the dark. Just silence and peace. Days passed. Then weeks. Life slowly crept back into its old rhythms, but Nathan knew he wasn't the same man he had been before that trip. And he was okay with that. The scars on his arm were healing, but they would never disappear completely, and neither would the memory of what happened. But it no longer controlled him, no longer to define him. It was just a story now, one he had survived, one he could finally let rest. And as he stood on his apartment balcony one evening, staring toward the horizon where the mountains still loomed in the distance, he smiled. Because for the first time in a long time, he felt free.